The first thing you noticed in the Tactical Operations Center at Fort Caswell was the noise. Not the gunfire from the valley below, though that was there too, steady and distant and wrong in the way that all real gunfire sounds wrong when you are not expecting it. The noise that hit you first was the radios, 6 of them, running simultaneously, voices overlapping, breaking apart, coming back. Words that had stopped making sense 10 minutes ago and were now just sounds, just signals, just proof that somewhere out in the tree line, people were dying. Faster than anyone had planned. Colonel Brett Dunmore stood at the center of the room with both hands flat on the map table. His knuckles were white. The topographic map beneath his palms showed Ridgeline Valley in careful brown contour lines, and someone had already been covering it in red grease pencil marks. 3 contact points on the western slope, 2 more along the valley floor, the kind of marks that told story you did not want to read. There were 14 people in that room, and every one of them was watching the colonel, every one of them except the radio operator at Station 2, who was watching the empty chair beside him. It was a plain metal folding chair, slightly pushed back from the console, the way a person leaves a chair when they expect to return in a few minutes. There was a cold coffee cup on the console next to it. There was a legal pad with calculations written in small, precise handwriting. The name on the station assignment board above it read as G.T. Selden. The chair had been empty for 41 minutes. Dunmore looked at that chair, and something moved across his face that was not concern and was not grief and was not quite relief either. Then the radio screamed again, and he looked back at the map, and the story returned to the beginning. 36 hours earlier, Sergeant First Class Tara Selden had been exactly where she was supposed to be. That was the problem, in a way. She was always where she was supposed to be. She sat at her radio station in the communications annex at 5:45, 2 hours before her shift technically started, because the shift before hers tended to leave the equipment log incomplete, and she had stopped asking anyone to fix that. She maintained the log herself. She had learned a long time ago that if you wanted a thing done correctly, you did it yourself and said nothing about it. The communications annex was a long room with low ceilings and too many cables running along the baseboards. It smelled like burned coffee and electronics, a combination Selden had stopped noticing after the first month. She was good at not noticing things that could not be changed. She was equally good at noticing things that could. She noticed, for example, that the morning print queue had been running since 4:30, and that the third document in the stack was a revised route sheet for the following day's battalion exercise. She was not supposed to be reviewing route sheets. Her assignment was communication support, which meant she sat at a radio, maintained the equipment log, and transmitted position reports on a schedule that had not varied in the 4 months since her reassignment to Fort Caswell. She pulled the route sheet anyway. It was standard formatting. The exercise involved a full battalion movement through the Ridgeline Valley training corridor, beginning at 7:30 the following morning and terminating at a consolidation point 12 kilometers to the northeast. The route was marked in blue on the attached map overlay. 394 personnel, 7 armored vehicles, estimated transit time to the far end of the valley, 47 minutes. Selden set the route sheet down and opened her field notebook. It was a small thing, the notebook. Green canvas cover, water-resistant, the kind sold at military surplus stores for $12. She had been carrying one like it since her first year in the Army, and she filled them at a rate that occasionally surprised people who happened to notice. This one was 3/4 full. She flipped to a page marked with a torn strip of paper and spread it flat on the console beside the root sheet. The notation she had made 6 weeks earlier occupied most of the page. It was a terrain assessment, written in her own shorthand, of the Ridgeline Valley training corridor. She had compiled it after reviewing aerial photography that came across the general communications feed and cross-referencing it with the standard training area maps posted in the operations building. The assessment was not her assignment. No one had asked for it. She had submitted it through the proper channels anyway, attaching a brief summary to the weekly intelligence update request form. The response had come back in 4 days. Someone had stamped it with a block of text that read outside current tasking and added a handwritten note at the bottom above your pay grade. She had kept the assessment in her notebook because she kept everything. Now she set the notebook and the root sheet side by side and looked at them for a long moment without moving. The blue line on the root sheet passed directly through 2 grid squares that she had marked in her assessment as high probability ambush terrain. The ground there was a natural killbox. Elevated ridgelines on 3 sides, limited vehicle egress, the valley floor funneled movement in a single direction for nearly 2 kilometers before the terrain opened up again. She looked at the time stamp on the root sheet, printed at 4:12, approved. At 3:57, the approval signature belonged to Colonel Dunmore. Selden wrote 2 grid numbers in the margin of her notebook, tore the page out carefully, folded it into her breast pocket, and went back to the equipment log. She did not stop thinking about those 2 grid squares for the rest of the morning. The briefing was at 1400 hours in the main operations building, large enough to hold every senior NCO and officer assigned to the exercise. Selden was not a senior NCO, and she was not assigned to the exercise in any capacity that required her presence. She attended anyway. This was technically permitted under the general orders governing open access to unit briefings, a policy that no one actually exercised because no one had any reason to. She sat in the back row. She had her notebook. The briefing ran through the standard categories: weather, overcast, no precipitation expected; terrain, the valley corridor as mapped; enemy forces. OPFOR simulating a hostile cell operating from prepared positions. Estimated 40 to 60 personnel from the Training Support Battalion. Communications. Standard exercise frequencies, with a backup net on Channel 7. When the terrain slide came up, Selden looked at the route marked in blue and felt something tighten in her chest. From the front of the room, Colonel Dunmore was already talking, moving to the next slide, the one covering vehicle spacing and march order. She raised her hand. There was a moment of specific silence that came with being noticed in a room where your presence was technically permitted but practically unusual. Dunmore turned from the projection screen and looked at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally something else. As she stood, she said she had a terrain assessment that identified probable ambush positions along the planned route and asked permission to walk through the key points. which would take approximately 4 minutes. She had a range card prepared. She had been working on it since 600. It was precise. It accounted for the elevated firing positions on the western and northern ridgelines, the limited cover available to dismounted personnel on the valley floor, and the projected response time for close air support given the current weather conditions and aircraft availability. At the bottom of the card, in her small handwriting, she had written 2 words: no egress. She placed the range card on the table in front of her and slid it forward. Dunmore picked it up. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down on the edge of the table in a way that made it clear the next thing was going to be the floor. He said, without looking at her directly, that she was not on the exercise roster, and he was not certain how she had gotten into this briefing. She told him she had walked through the door. He looked at her then. He reached into the folder on the podium in front of him and removed a sheet of paper. He unfolded it slowly. The room was very quiet. He read from it. He did not read quickly or privately. He read the way a person reads something they have been waiting to read, with deliberate precision and a certain satisfaction in the pauses between sentences. He was reading from her psychological evaluation, the one conducted 14 months ago in conjunction with the formal complaint she had filed against a previous commanding officer. The words he was reading out loud in a room containing 22 people included phrases like prone to obsessive pattern recognition and difficulty integrating within established command structures, and poor candidate for field leadership due to inflexibility in dynamic environments. He folded the paper again. He asked if she had a response. She had many responses. She chose none of them. She picked up her range card from the table, tucked it back into her notebook, and sat down. 22 pairs of eyes were on her. She counted the rows of folding chairs. To the exit, 12 rows, 8 chairs per row. The nearest window was sealed. The air conditioning unit in the far wall was running at full capacity and generating approximately 60 decibels of background noise, which she knew because she had checked the maintenance report that morning for an unrelated reason. She said nothing else. Dunmore continued the briefing. She sat in her chair with her notebook closed on her lap and kept her face as flat as the range card she had spent 6 hours preparing. Afterward, in the corridor outside, she heard it, a voice somewhere behind her, low enough to be deniable and loud enough to be deliberate. Paper Sergeant. She did not know which of the 22 people said it. She did not turn around. She walked to the end of the corridor, pushed through the exterior door, and stood in the afternoon heat for a moment with her hand still on the door handle. The range card in her notebook said that the first probable ambush position on the western ridgeline had an estimated firing radius that covered the entire 2-kilometer stretch of the valley floor, a crew-served weapon at that position with adequate ammunition could maintain fire on the route for 11 minutes before needing to relocate or reload. 11 minutes. The battalion would be on the valley floor for 47 minutes total. She let go of the door handle. She walked back to the communications annex and sat down at her station and stared at the equipment log for a while without writing anything in it. It was Command Sergeant Major Gerald Oakes who found her there. He was a large man, not in terms of height but in terms of presence, the way that a certain kind of person who has been doing difficult work for a very long time develops a kind of density that younger people do not yet have. He had the hands of someone who had spent decades carrying and maintaining equipment in conditions that equipment was not designed for. He was 58 years old and had been in the Army for 34 years, which meant he had started young and had never seriously considered stopping. He pulled a chair up beside her station without asking. He sat. He looked at the equipment log for a moment, not reading it, just looking at it. Then he reached into the front pocket of his uniform and placed 3 things on the console beside her: coffee cup, a folded paper with 6 digits written on it, a small laminated card with a radio frequency and a call sign, a photograph printed on standard copy paper, slightly creased from being folded and unfolded more than once. He told her the 6 digits were the armory access code for the storage K, where the M2010s were secured. He told her the frequency was a backup net that ran outside the standard exercise communications architecture, a legacy channel from a previous training rotation that had never been formally decommissioned. He did not explain the photograph. She unfolded it. It was taken with a phone, grainy in the way of images captured at distance, and then enlarged in post-processing. It showed the front gate of Fort Caswell. In early morning light, a vehicle was stopped at the guard post, a dark sedan, and a man in civilian clothes was standing at the driver's window, leaning, slightly talking to whoever was inside. The man was viewed from behind and slightly to the side. He wore a dark jacket and a ball cap. She could not see his face. She could see his left hand. Oakes told her he had taken the photograph himself 3 days ago at 6:20 in the morning. He said he had been meaning to do something with it and had not yet decided what. She asked who was in the vehicle. He told her that was the right question. He stood. He was almost at the door before he stopped without turning back and said something she would think about for the rest of that night. He said he needed her to keep the photograph safe, not to look at it, not to report it, to keep it safe. Then he was gone. She looked at the photograph for a long time. The man at the window was visible from behind, his left arm resting on the door frame, his left hand partially visible. He wore no watch, but on the 4th finger of his left hand there was a ring, a thick band, not a wedding ring, the kind that had a specific institutional meaning. She had seen that style exactly once before, at a ceremony she had attended during her advanced training. It was an SFAS completion ring, Special Forces Assessment and Selection, the kind given to soldiers who had successfully completed that particular program and wanted something physical to mark it. She set the photograph down. She pulled up the exercise OPFOR roster on the administrative network, available to her because communications support personnel required access to coordinate frequencies and call signs. The roster had 48 names. One had been added 48 hours ago. It was not a name from the training support battalion. Cord Lyle ACWO, retired, civilian contractor, opposing force advisor. She looked at that name for a while. It was familiar in the specific way that things are familiar when you know you have a response to them but cannot locate what it is, like a sound heard in a different context, like a smell that belongs to a different room. She wrote it in her notebook and closed the notebook and locked her station. That night she lay on top of her bunk for a long time without sleeping. Usually, when she could not sleep, it was because her mind continued working on the problem in front of it and refused to reduce its activity to a level compatible with rest. Tonight the problem had no clean edges yet. It was presenting as a feeling rather than a question. At 2300 hours she got up. She spread the field notebook open on the small desk and photographed every page, not just the terrain assessment, every page, all the calculations, the range cards, the grid references, the times and dates she had been recording. For the past 4 months, in the methodical way she recorded everything. She did this carefully, making sure each image was legible, making sure nothing was cut off at the edges. At 3:04, she uploaded the entire set of images to a secure partition on a personal encrypted drive backed up to an off-site server she paid for out of her own pocket. It was not a dramatic thing. It was the same thing she had been doing for 11 months in 5 different duty stations since the day she understood that documents had a way of disappearing when people wanted them to. She looked at the last page she had photographed. It was the Ridgeline Valley terrain assessment from 6 weeks ago. At the bottom of the page, below the grid references and the firing radius calculations, she had written 3 words in her own shorthand. Probable killbox, valley floor. She had written those words 3 weeks before anyone finalized the exercise route. She set the phone down. She lay back on the bunk. She stared at the ceiling and let the problem run through its iterations until it arrived at the part that made her sit up again in the dark. The psychological evaluation. She had been so focused in the briefing room on managing what Dunmore was doing that she had not fully processed the fact that he had been able to do it at all. He had stood at that podium and read from her psychological evaluation. He had a copy of it in his folder. He had brought it to that briefing. Those facts had been the entire foreground of the moment. The background was something different. Her psychological evaluation was not filed in her personnel jacket. It was filed in her official medical record. 2 separate systems, 2 separate sets of regulations, 2 separate authorization requirements. A commanding officer reviewing a soldier's personnel file for duty assignment purposes could access the first one. He could not access the second. To open a sealed medical record in the United States Army, you needed a signed waiver from the subject of that record, or a formal request processed through the Inspector General's office with documented operational justification, or a court order. She knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent 14 months learning the administrative boundaries of a formal complaint process, that Dunmore had none of those things. She sat in the dark with that fact and looked at it from several angles. He had not stumbled across her evaluation by accident. He had gone looking for it. He had known it existed, known what system it was filed in, and found a way to open it that bypassed every authorization designed to prevent exactly that kind of access. He had done this before the briefing, before she arrived, before she raised her hand. He had prepared for her specifically, which meant he had known her name, which meant he had gone looking for information about her, which meant that at some point something she had done had caused someone with access to Dunmore to say her name in connection with something that made Dunmore decide she was worth researching. She was not a paper sergeant who had found a dangerous route by accident. She was someone who had noticed the wrong thing 6 weeks ago and filed a report about it, and that report had arrived on a desk where it was not welcome, and the person at that desk had spent the time since building a response. She put the notebook on the desk. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she picked up the photograph again, the one Oakes had given her, and she looked at the ring on the left hand of the man at the gate, and something connected quietly and with the specific certainty of mathematics arriving at a result that was always going to be there. Dunmore had worked the crowd at the base transition ceremony 3 months ago. She had been managing audio equipment at the edges of the room. She had observed because she observed everything. She remembered the ring. She remembered it because she had noted it as unusual on a man who was not special forces, because not every officer who attended that ceremony had the background to earn what that ring meant. She remembered it now because the ring in the photograph was on the hand of the man in the vehicle at the gate, and the hand in the photograph was the hand of someone Cord had come to meet, and the hand she was thinking about was the hand of Colonel Brett Dunmore. She placed the photograph face down on the desk. She turned off the light. She lay still and let the 2.5 hours pass. At 5:12, she got up, dressed, and walked to the motor pool. The battalion was staging for the morning movement. In the pre-dawn dark, the vehicles looked like a row of patient animals, their hulls beaded with condensation, the smell of diesel fuel rising in the cool air. Soldiers moved between them with the particular combination of efficiency and exhaustion that characterized early morning operations. Nobody was talking much. Command Sergeant Major Gerald Oakes was standing at the edge of the motor pool. With a coffee cup in his hand, she stood beside him. They watched the vehicles for a while without speaking. Then Oakes told her, without looking at her, that the name on the OPFOR roster, the man listed as a civilian contractor, Cord Lyle A., had been the lead instructor for the Army Sniper School qualification evaluation she had attended at Fort Moore 2 years ago. He told her that Cord had been separated from the Army 8 months after conducting that evaluation. The reason listed in the separation record was a single word: redacted. Selden absorbed this. She asked if Oakes was telling her what she thought he was telling her. He said he was not telling her anything. He was standing at a motor pool before sunrise drinking bad coffee. That was all he was doing. The first vehicle in the column turned over its engine. The sound moved through the staging area like something felt more than heard, a low vibration that came up through the ground and through the soles of her boots and into the bones of her feet. She watched the vehicles begin to roll. She counted them. 394 people moving toward a valley she had marked in her notebook 6 weeks ago and had been told was above her pay grade. She went back to the communications annex. She sat at her station. She watched the clock. 47 minutes later, it began. The radio did not build toward disaster. It crossed from routine traffic to catastrophe in a single transmission, a voice cutting through the standard exercise frequencies with a report that was not a training report. The voice belonged to a captain whose designation she recognized from the march order, and he was not using the controlled language of a simulated scenario. He was using the voice of a man who had just discovered that the worst thing he had been afraid of was actually a smaller version of the real thing. Contact west and north, multiple positions, vehicles taking fire. She could hear the weapons behind his voice. She stayed at her station for 30 seconds. She looked at the route sheet, still sitting at the edge of the console. She looked at the field notebook. She looked at the armory access code, in Oak's handwriting on the folded paper. She put on her body armor, drew her sidearm and walked to the armory. The M2010 was in the third rack from the left, locked in its transit case with the optics secured in a padded compartment beside it. She had never checked this weapon out before. She had never had reason to. She assembled it in the low light of the cage, loophole Mark IV optic to the rail, bolt cycled in. Cleared, suppressor hand tightened to the muzzle threads, torque verified. She had done this with her eyes closed in training. She could do it faster than most people could read about it. She loaded a 5-round magazine of match grade, Winchester Magnum. Ammunition, 220 grain subsonic. She took 2 additional loaded magazines from the sealed storage box beside the transit case. She checked each one. She secured them in the cargo pockets of her trousers. She signed the equipment log. Under purpose she wrote, range maintenance. She walked out of the armory and across the empty motor pool and into the tree line, and she did not stop. The forest closed behind her. The sound of the radio room faded. The sound of the valley was already audible from this distance. Distant and continuous and very real. From the second-floor window of the Tactical Operations Center, Colonel Brett Dunmore stood at the glass with his hands clasped behind his back and watched her disappear into the tree line. He did not reach for the phone. He did not call for her to be stopped. He watched until the trees took her, and then he turned back to the map, and his face told nothing that anyone in the room could read. The western ridgeline was 400 meters above the valley floor, and Selden had been working toward it for 23 minutes when she heard the first RPG. The sound of it was different from the direct fire that had been running since she left the tree line. An RPG in flight had a quality somewhere between a whistle and a sigh, followed by the flat concussive impact of detonation. She heard it, registered its origin point from the acoustic signature it left against the hillside, and adjusted her line. She moved the way she had been trained to move, short intervals, cover 2. Cover, no 2 consecutive movements in the same direction, the suppressor on. The M2010 added weight she was already accounting for in her balance. The morning was cool, and the air had a stillness that was useful for what she intended to do. She reached the first position at 24 minutes after entering the tree line. It was a natural firing platform, a shelf of exposed granite on the upper western ridgeline, at approximately 900 meters above the valley floor. She had identified it in her terrain assessment 6 weeks ago. She knew its offset from the primary firing positions below. She knew the wind pattern from the east at this time of morning in these atmospheric conditions. She knew the ballistic drop for a 220 grain Winchester Magnum round at 910 meters under the current temperature and barometric pressure. She lay flat. She set the bipod. She regulated her breathing. She opened her notebook and confirmed 2 numbers. Through the optics she found the first position on the valley floor, a crew served weapon emplaced behind a prepared berm of earth and timber that had been there for more than 48 hours, based on the settling visible at the base of the dirt work. Someone had built this before the exercise started. She observed the two men operating it. She read the wind off the heat signature of their barrel. She read the mirage off the ground between her position and theirs. She calculated 90 seconds. That was how long she lay there without firing. 90 seconds of mathematics and patience, and the particular kind of stillness that is not the absence of intention but its complete consolidation. Then she fired. The suppressor reduced the report to something a person 20 meters away might mistake for a branch breaking at distance. The round was in flight before the sound reached anyone nearby. At 910 meters, the physics were indifferent to anything except the numbers she had calculated, and the numbers were correct. The crew-served weapon stopped. She was already moving. She changed position in 30 seconds, covering 80 meters along the ridgeline to the secondary firing platform she had mapped from the aerial photography. She was prone again before anyone in the valley had fully processed what had just happened. She took a slow breath. She looked through the optic at the northern ridgeline, where the second element would be positioned based on the angle of the RPG she had heard. She scanned the crest line from east to west, reading it in sections the way she read everything. And there, a figure at the edge of the tree line on the northern slope, a man with a spotting scope and a rifle on a bipod that had not yet been used. He was watching the valley. He was also watching the western ridgeline, which was where she had been 30 seconds ago. She watched him. The way he held his body against the ground was not something that could be taught in a classroom. It was the result of years of specific repetition. The way his left elbow was positioned against the slope, the angle of his shoulders, the spacing of his legs, exact and unhurried, the posture of a man who had done this more times than he could count and had stopped thinking about it. The way a carpenter stops thinking about how to hold a hammer. She had seen that posture exactly once before. On a firing range. She had been facing downrange at the time, prone in lane 7, working through a qualification string at 900 meters. She had not been looking at the man behind her. She had been doing what she was there to do, but she had heard his footsteps on the gravel between the lanes, and she had caught his silhouette in her peripheral vision when he stopped behind her, and she had noted the way he stood because she noted everything, filed it, and moved on. She had fired 5 rounds, all 5 in the 10 ring at 900 meters. The range officer had confirmed each impact. She had heard the confirmation after each round, and she had maintained her position and her breathing, and she had waited for the evaluation. She heard the pen on the clipboard before she heard a word spoken. She heard him write before he said anything at all. And when the form came back, it said fail, and she had looked at it for 1 second, and she had looked at the 5 confirmed impacts in the 10 ring at 900 meters, and she had set the form down and removed her ear protection and walked off the line without saying a word. That was 2 years ago. She lay on the granite shelf of the western ridgeline of Fort Caswell with the M2010 pointed at the northern slope, and she looked at the man she had last seen walking away from her on a firing line at Fort Moore, and she understood with the specific and absolute clarity that comes from having all the data finally in one place at one time that this had never been an exercise. Not the battalion movement, not the OPFOR roster, not the route through a valley she had marked as a killbox 6 weeks ago. She had forgotten his face over 2 years. She had never forgotten his stance. She knew who was on the northern ridgeline. That knowledge arrived with a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. It settled into her thinking the way facts always settled, without drama, without hesitation, arranged in order of implication. Lyle Cord, civilian. Contractor, opposing force advisor, the man who had written fail on an evaluation form, while 5 confirmed impacts were still being called out by a range officer 2 years ago. He was here on this ridge, at this particular moment in this particular valley. Which meant none of this was an exercise. Which meant the route through Ridgeline Valley had not been selected because of training requirements or terrain variety. It had been selected because someone had needed 394 people in a specific piece of ground at a specific time for a specific purpose, which meant the psychological evaluation that Dunmore had read aloud in a briefing room yesterday had not been retrieved out of operational curiosity. It had been retrieved because the person who retrieved it had been anticipating this day and working methodically to ensure that when it arrived, she would already be discredited, isolated, and removed from any position where she could be useful. She held all of that in her mind for exactly 3 seconds. Then she set it aside. 394 people were still in that valley. The crew served weapon she had eliminated 4 minutes ago had created a temporary reduction in the fire, but the sound coming up from the floor told her 2 things. The battalion had not found a protected line of movement, and at least 2 additional firing positions were still active on the western and northern approaches. She worked. She moved 40 meters north along the ridgeline to the secondary granite shelf she had identified in her terrain assessment 6 weeks ago, staying below the crest line and moving on her hands and knees where the ground cover fell away. The M2010 was cradled across her forearms. She moved without noise. During the 11-minute transit between her first firing position and the secondary shelf she had mapped, she switched out the spent magazine and loaded a fresh 5-round magazine from the cargo pocket of her trousers. She did this without stopping, working by feel, the same way she had assembled the weapon in the armory cage before dawn. She did not count the new rounds. She knew what was in the magazine because she had loaded it herself. From the new position, she had a sight angle into the valley floor that was slightly different from her first. 3 armored vehicles were stationary. Below, one had its front end canted against the roadside berm, smoke rising from the engine compartment. The soldiers visible from her elevation were using the vehicles for cover, which was the right decision with what they knew, what they could not see from their position, and what she could see from hers was that the firing positions above them had been prepared in advance. The berms along the approach were not natural formations. They had been built by hand over a period of days, by people who knew which vehicle would stop at which point on which road. She found the RPG team at 780 meters. They were positioned on the low northern slope where the tree line stepped back from a rock ledge, creating a natural platform that faced the valley. At approximately 30 degrees of depression, there were 3 men. The gunner was kneeling, His loader stood directly behind him with the second round already extracted from the pack, ready to reload in the 4-second interval between shots. The third man was watching the valley through binoculars, calling adjustments. The setup was professional, the spacing was right, the angles were correct. This was not a group of amateurs who had found a map and a motive. This was prepared work. She reached for the backup radio before she reached for the bolt. The frequency Oakes had given her was running a steady carrier signal. She pressed the transmit key twice. A pause, one click came back. She said Valley North, 780, 3 personnel, RPG active. Oakes said take them. She said 1 round, shoulder. A pause on the line. She said non-lethal, I will explain later. She set the radio down and settled into the stock. She began the process. That was not instinct and not reflex. It was mathematics performed with a body that had learned to become very still at the moments when stillness was the hardest thing. Wind from the southwest at approximately 9 miles per hour, gusting to 12 across the open ground above the ledge. Temperature readings she had taken at dawn and corrected for the current hour. Barometric pressure from the morning brief. Drop calculation for 220. Grain at 780 meters. 38 seconds. That was the total time between settling into position and firing. The round traveled 780 meters in less than 1 second. It struck the gunner in the right shoulder at the rear of the deltoid. He went down. The RPG tube dropped from his hands. His loader grabbed for it, missed, then looked at the empty tree line and made the calculation that most people make in that moment. The person doing this to us can see us and we cannot see them. He ran. The third man followed. The RPG lay on the ledge, pointed at the sky. Selden was already moving. The backup radio keyed. Oakes, you did not kill him. She was climbing. She said, I know. He said, why? She said, ask me later. Then she cut the transmit function and focused on her footing. 12 miles from Ridgeline Valley, in the Tactical Operations Center at Fort Caswell, a radio technician had been running a signals analysis on the incoming traffic for the past 6 minutes. He was specifically tracking the acoustic profiles of the suppressed fire reports, which were generating signatures distinct from the standard exercise blank fire data. The analysis had been running in the background while he managed primary communications. And when the system returned a caliber match, he looked at it, confirmed the direction of origin from the triangulation overlay, and turned toward the colonel. Dunmore was already watching him. The technician said, M2010 suppressed, Western Ridgeline, independent. Shooter, sir. Single origin point, no affiliation marker in the exercise net. Dunmore looked at him without expression. He said, confirmed triangulation. The technician read the grid reference aloud. Dunmore repeated it quietly to himself. He looked at the map table. He looked at it for 4 seconds, which in that room in that moment was a noticeable amount of time for a colonel to spend looking at a map before responding to a significant piece of information. He picked up the secondary handset. He dialed a 4-digit extension. He spoke briefly in a voice too low for the technician to parse precisely. He replaced the handset. The quick reaction force flight path had been adjusted 12 kilometers to the east. 19 minutes of additional response time had been created where no additional time was needed. His aide, a staff sergeant standing 2 meters behind him with a notepad, wrote nothing down. He had worked for Colonel Dunmore for 7 months. He understood certain things about how information moved in this building and how it stopped moving. He held his notepad. He looked at the floor. He said nothing. Dunmore said to the room, "Continue standard monitoring. Report any change in fire patterns." He turned back to the map. Selden reached the position she had identified as the best angle on the northern ridgeline. It took her 11 minutes when she was prone and the bipod was set and the optic was up. She scanned the area where she had last observed cord. The ledge was empty, not abandoned in a hurry, empty in the deliberate way of a position that had been vacated with patience and preparation. The soil at the edge of the ledge showed the impression of a bipod. The grass behind it was compressed in the outline of a prone figure. A single spent casing had been left on the flat rock near the ledge rim. She looked at it through the optic. It was oriented at an angle, not dropped, placed. He had calculated her transit time from her previous position to this one. He had been gone before she arrived. He knew how she moved. She did not let herself sit fully with what that meant. She noted it, logged it in the part of her thinking reserved for operational data, and continued working. What she needed to understand now was the larger shape of what was happening below and around her. She scanned the valley for 90 seconds with the methodical precision she brought to every observation, north to south, crest to floor, marking what had changed since her last look. The battalion had found partial cover near the valley's midpoint. The radio traffic she was pulling from the exercise frequency had shifted character. In the last 8 minutes, the panic transmissions from the first contact had given way to something more controlled, shorter, more purposeful. Unit leadership was functioning again under fire. That mattered. It meant there was a structure she could work with, a formation that could respond to a changing tactical picture if she could give them the space to respond. She was mapping the geometry of that space in her head when the backup radio opened with a transmission she was not expecting. It was not Oak's. The signal came in clearly, 2 voices. Oakes had patched an external feed into her receive frequency without enabling her transmit, which meant she could hear the conversation without entering it. She understood that in the first quarter second. The first voice took a full second to register. Low, even, the deliberate register of a man who had made all his decisions before speaking. She had heard it on a firing range 2 years ago, and she had not heard it since, and the 2 years of distance between that firing line and this ridgeline compressed into something very thin when it arrived through the speaker. She pressed herself lower against the cold granite. She listened. The voice said, "She knows where I was. She moved to counter. I relocated before she arrived." A second voice responded, clipped, controlled, "Dunmore." Dunmore said, "Your timeline." Cord said, "The short route to my current position is 4 minutes at her pace. I have prepared the approach." Dunmore said, "Then you have 4 minutes." She understood what was underneath those 7 words. Not a deadline, not a tactical instruction, an authorization. Dunmore was not coordinating a containment strategy. He was not trying to restore order in the valley below. He was telling a man with a rifle that the person moving toward him on the western ridgeline should not arrive at her destination. She stayed still for a moment. She thought about what Oakes had done by patching that conversation to her. He had given her the geometry of the problem before she walked into it. She began moving toward the short route. The tripwire was at ankle height, monofilament line nearly transparent, tied at one end to a steel stake driven into the soft soil at the base of a pine and at the other end to the pull pin of a directional mine set into the deadfall 6 inches off the ground. In the available light without a specific reason to look for it, the line was effectively invisible. She felt it with the toe of her left boot before she stepped through it. She stopped. She crouched, she looked. She traced the line with her eyes from the stake to the mine casing buried in the leaf litter. She stood, she took one step back, then another. She stood on the edge of the short route and looked at the work in front of her. Cord had not improvised this. He had placed it during preparation. Before the exercise began, before the battalion had moved, he had known she would come this way because he had built the conditions that would make this the obvious path. She turned. She took the long route. The long route added 7 minutes to her transit, 7 minutes during which the valley was still taking fire, during which the QRF was now 19 minutes further away than it should have been, during which 394 people were making decisions based on an incomplete picture. 7 minutes. She ran. Not a sprint, the controlled, economical movement of a person navigating broken terrain at maximum sustainable speed without losing stability. She kept the rifle low. She placed each foot with precision on ground she had not previously mapped. She moved through the trees and undergrowth and the broken slope with the kind of focused attention that was not the same as hurry. Oakes keyed the channel at the 5-minute mark. She did not answer. She crested a secondary ridge at 13 minutes and found cover behind a fallen trunk. She went prone. She brought the M2010 up and began scanning the northern slope. She did not find Cord's position immediately. She scanned systematically. The way she had been trained, the way she had practiced since before she was authorized to use the method she was now using, north to south, crest to midslope. She was on her second pass when the transmission she had been listening to earlier came back to her not as sound, but as memory. The voice. She had heard it on a firing line at Fort Moore on a Tuesday morning in October. The air had been cool and flat, and there had been no wind to account for, which had made the problem cleaner than most of the strings. She had run that week. She had been in lane 7. She had placed her equipment with the precision she always used. She had addressed the target in the standard fashion, which was not a ritual and not a comfort habit, but simply the correct sequence of steps for the correct outcome. The range officer had been on her left. Cord had been on her right, approximately 3 meters back, with a clipboard. She had fired the first round. Impact confirmed, 10 ring 900 meters. She had worked the bolt. Second round. Impact confirmed, third. Fourth, the range officer's voice had been steady throughout, calling each impact, recording each result in the log. She had heard everything. She had heard the officer. She had also heard, somewhere between the 4th and 5th rounds, the sound of a pen moving on a form in a way that had a particular quality. the quality of something being decided before the last piece of evidence was in. She had fired the fifth round anyway. Impact confirmed, 10 ring. She had removed her ear protection. She had turned around. The form was face down on the clipboard. Cord was signing his name in the signature block. Below a word she could read from the angle at which he was holding it. Fail. She had not said anything. She had picked up her equipment. She had walked off the firing line and back to the staging area, and she had sat in her vehicle for a while before she was ready to go inside. That was 2 years ago. She was prone on a ridgeline in North Carolina with a rifle pointed at a slope she could not yet fully read, and the voice from that firing line was still running in her recall with a clarity that 2 years had done nothing to reduce. She reached forward. She took the suppressor off the M2010. The threads were standard, 4 seconds to remove it cleanly. She set the suppressor in the outer pocket of her jacket. She looked at the unsuppressed rifle. In this terrain, a .300 Winchester Magnum round fired without suppression would be audible across the full range of the ridgelines and valley. Every person below and around her would hear it. Every person on every slope of this training area would know exactly that a shot had been fired and roughly from which direction. She wanted Lyle Cord to hear the next one coming. She located the mortar position at 1,050 meters. It was on the reverse slope of the northern ridge, behind the crest in a position that reduced its direct exposure to the valley while maintaining a workable angle into the consolidation area below. From her current elevation, she had a line of sight into that reverse slope through a natural terrain channel between 2 sections of ridgeline, a gap 40 meters wide. At its narrowest point at the range she needed 40 meters of working window at 1,050 meters. Wind reading. She watched the movement of the mid-canopy vegetation at 3 range intervals between her position and the target. She read the pattern. Southwest at approximately 12 miles per hour in the upper register. Variable in the lower register, consistent enough for a single calculation. Temperature had dropped 3 degrees since she had entered the tree line. She accounted for the effect on muzzle velocity. The shot required her to fire through the 40-meter gap at a slightly downward angle into the reverse slope, which affected the vertical component of the ballistic arc. She adjusted 45 seconds. She confirmed her data one more time. She controlled her breathing to the standard she had been training toward since she was 23 years old. She fired. The unsuppressed report of the .300 Winchester Magnum was large and flat and traveled outward in all directions simultaneously, the acoustic signature of something that had stopped trying to be quiet. 1,050 meters away on the reverse slope of the northern ridge, the mortar position went silent. She worked the bolt. She did not fire again. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the spent brass casing from her first shot of the morning. 300 Win Mag 220 grain, standard head stamp. Still warm from hours in the pocket against her body. She held it in her left hand. She looked around for a sharp edge of stone. She found one at the base of the fallen trunk. She worked the edge against the side of the brass for approximately 20 seconds. The letters were not precise. They were legible. Still here. She set the casing at the lip of her current firing position, oriented toward the northern slope, toward the direction from which Cord would approach when he came to search this ground. Then she moved 130 meters south along the ridgeline to a lower position. With a different angle and better concealment from the north, she had 3 rounds remaining. The valley below had begun to change, the gap in the fire coverage created by the mortar elimination had given the battalion something it had not had. For the past 40 minutes, movement options on the backup radio she could hear Oakes managing the exercise command frequency with the same measured efficiency he had been demonstrating all morning, feeding information in the direction it needed to go, creating the conditions for decisions he could not make himself. She was watching the northern crest line when the round hit. It struck the ground 20 meters to her left and slightly uphill. The soil erupted in a small column and fell back. She did not move. She noted the angle, noted the deflection, noted what it meant. Cord had relocated again. He had triangulated her unsuppressed shot. The 20-meter offset meant he had a reliable zone estimate, but not a precise coordinate. She stayed flat, absolutely still. She counted 8 seconds. Then she moved toward the impact point rather than away from it. She covered the 20 meters in a low, controlled traverse that put her in the acoustic shadow of the disturbed ground. Cord had fired from the northwest. He would calculate a retreat to the south. She went north and low, staying below the sight line of his last known position. The backup radio keyed. The signal carried outdoor ambience, the sound of an exposed hillside rather than a closed room. Cord said, "I can see your movement signature." She went still. He said, "You want to know something about Irene Bast?" She did not respond. He said, "She has been working this case for 18 months. Same documentation method as yours. Same formal complaint structure." A pause. He said, "She will not find me here." She processed this in pieces. He knew Bast by name. He knew the structure of her investigation. He had been monitoring it long enough to understand the method, and he was telling Selden not as information offered in good faith but as a statement of fact about a planned outcome. Bast would not find him here because here had been designed for a specific purpose, to be a location where things ended without leaving evidence. No cameras, no witnesses, just the terrain she had assessed 6 weeks ago and been told was above her pay grade. She moved. She was working through the mathematics of her remaining options when the transmission came through the patched frequency that changed the geometry of everything. It was Cord speaking to an element she had not yet accounted for, not Dunmore, a different voice, a unit designation she did not recognize. The content was 9 words. Southern element, advance on consolidation point delta, 7 minutes. She stopped. She lowered herself to the ground. She did not reach for the rifle. She reached for her notebook. Consolidation point delta. She knew that designation. It was the covered position near the valley midpoint, where the battalion leadership had been establishing their interim command. It was where the formation had been gathering after the initial ambush broke their march column. It was the natural collection point, the place where a broken unit under fire instinctively consolidates, which made it exactly the right target for a secondary ambush. She had assessed the eastern slope in her terrain analysis 6 weeks ago. She had graded it as secondary threat terrain because the sight lines were interrupted and the egress for a firing element was limited. She had weighted those limitations heavily in her assessment because they were real limitations. What she had not fully weighted was the scenario in which those limitations were irrelevant, in which the primary objective had already been achieved, in which the battalion had already been driven from the open valley floor and compressed into a single location that was known in advance. In that scenario, a secondary element on the eastern slope did not need unobstructed sight lines. They needed one confirmed location. They had it, and they had been given 7 minutes to complete their movement to the firing position. She worked through the geometry in 20 seconds. The valley consolidation point was approximately 2 kilometers northeast of her current position. She could not reach it before the secondary element did. She could not reach the secondary element's firing position before they were in it. What she could potentially reach was their logistics position, the supply cache that any element this size, conducting an operation of this duration, would have positioned behind the firing line for access during the engagement. She looked at the eastern slope. She found the canopy break she was looking for. It was the place where a secondary ridgeline dropped behind a stand of mature timber, creating a sheltered approach to the slope that was not visible from the valley floor. Standard cache placement for this terrain type, she had noted it in her assessment. She was at 1,120 meters from that position. She had 3 rounds. 1 had been fired at the mortar, 2 remained. If she used a round on cord, she likely missed. She had an approximate zone, not a precise fix. A miss against a trained sniper in this terrain meant he relocated, and she had spent a round she could not recover. If she used a round on the secondary cache, she did not eliminate the element, she disrupted them. Disruption was not elimination, but disruption changed a timeline. It changed what 7 minutes meant when you were trying to conduct a coordinated ambush with partial ammunition. And the battalion at Consolidation Point Delta needed time more than anything else. Time was the thing that had been deliberately taken from them by 19 minutes of rerouted quick reaction force. If she could give some of it back, even 5 minutes, even 3, she changed what the next hour looked like for 394 people. She found the sight line. The angle was steep. The available window in the canopy break was narrow. The range was 1,120 meters, which was at the outer edge of the weapon's verified performance envelope under ideal conditions, and conditions at this moment were not ideal. She opened her notebook. She confirmed her data. She read the wind off the upper canopy movement at 4 intervals between her position and the target. She recalculated for the angle. She adjusted for the temperature. She took the time she needed. She fired 1,120 meters away on the eastern slope of Ridgeline Valley. A series of secondary detonations moved through the tree line in a rolling sequence lasting approximately 4 seconds. The cache was gone. The secondary element was intact, armed, and operational, but their ammunition supply had just been reduced to what they were carrying on their persons, and their timeline for conducting a coordinated ambush had just become something they could not reliably estimate. The battalion at Consolidation Point Delta had time that had not existed 30 seconds ago. She lay flat, and let the sound of the secondary detonations finish carrying. Across the ridgeline. 2 rounds remaining. She keyed the backup radio. Her voice was level. She said, "I need 8 minutes. Keep the colonel off my frequency." Oakes did not respond immediately. When he did, there was something in his voice that she recognized from their conversation at the motor pool before sunrise, the register of a man who had already done his weighing before he spoke. He said, "Copy. I'm about to do something that gets me court-martialed." The frequency went to carrier signal. She began moving north. 12 miles from the valley, in the Tactical Operations Center at Fort Caswell, an aide stood at his desk in the outer room when he heard footsteps. In the corridor, he looked up. He stopped moving when he recognized who was walking past him. Command Sergeant Major Gerald Oakes did not acknowledge the aide. He walked directly to the door of Colonel Dunmore's office, which was closed, and he opened it without knocking, and he stepped through it, and he pulled it shut behind him. The aide stood at his desk with his notepad and did not move. In Ridgeline Valley, 394 soldiers were at Consolidation Point Delta. They had a disrupted secondary ambush behind them. They had a damaged primary corridor ahead of them. They had a quick reaction force that was now 19 minutes further from them than the original estimate had promised. On the northern slope of the ridgeline, a man named Lyle Cord was searching the ground at a firing position he had expected to find empty. He found a spent brass casing on the flat rock at the lip of the position. He picked it up. He read what was scratched into it with 2 fingers, turning it slightly to catch the available light. He held it for a moment. He looked at the ridgeline. Selden had 2 rounds remaining. Cord was somewhere on that northern slope, with a position she still did not have. The colonel's door was closed behind a man who had 34 years of service and apparently had made his decision about what those 34 years were worth. The battalion had borrowed time that could not hold forever. 3 clocks were running simultaneously. She was the only one still running all 3. She moved north through the hardest terrain she had encountered all morning. The ridgeline above Cord's last known position did not offer the clean granite shelves of the western face. What it offered instead was fractured shale and root-tangled slope, ground that broke unpredictably underfoot and demanded constant correction. She had been on her hands and knees for the last 8 minutes of the approach, and the rock had been taking its toll on her palms, in the way that sharp stone always does when you are moving fast and your attention is divided between the terrain and the problem beyond it. Her hands were cut, not deeply, not in a way that changed the mechanics of what she was doing, but they were bleeding in the persistent way of palm cuts, slow and steady, and the blood had transferred to the grip of the M2010 in a pattern she was aware of without being distracted by it. She had wrapped the left hand in a strip torn from the hem of her undershirt sometime in the 7th minute of the climb. The right hand she left unwrapped because the right hand was the one that needed precise motor function, and anything constricting the fingers reduced that precision by a margin she was not prepared to accept. The right hand was also trembling. Not from the cold, not from the cuts, from 3 hours of sustained exertion across terrain that had asked more of her than any qualification exercise she had trained through, from maintaining grip and position and movement on a ridgeline that had not been built for what she was asking of it. The trembling was a fine vibration she could feel in the bones of her forearm when she held the rifle horizontally. She stopped. She knelt behind a column of broken shale. She looked at the right hand. She thought about the next shot. She thought about what the trembling meant. For the calculation she had already run, she thought about the difference between a tremor that was a warning and a tremor that was information. She said quietly to no one, "Math first, body second." She held the right hand flat against the cold face of the shale for 20 seconds. The stone drew the heat and with it some of the vibration. She flexed the fingers once. She checked the grip. She picked up the M2010. She continued north. She had been tracking Cord's position through the evidence he left rather than through direct observation, and the evidence was consistent. He was moving with discipline, but he was moving toward a destination, not retreating toward the valley floor, not retreating toward the western face, moving along the northern crest in a direction that suggested he had a specific point in mind. Rather than simply a direction of travel, a man who had prepared an entry had prepared an exit. She had understood that since she found the monofilament wire on the short route. She knew what exits looked like on this kind of terrain. She had spent 6 weeks thinking about this particular piece of ground, and she had noted the access points and the natural terrain, features that a sophisticated operation would use. There was one position on the northern crest that offered what an extraction point required: concealment from both the valley floor and the base perimeter, a workable downslope approach through the tree line, and enough distance from the primary engagement area to avoid observation by anyone. Managing the aftermath. She was moving toward that position. She found him 8 minutes later. He was prone behind a natural berm of earth at the northern crest, 212 meters from where she was crouching behind a stand of pine at the edge of the slope break. He was watching the valley through binoculars, not through a scope. His rifle was on the ground beside him, bolt not engaged. In the casual orientation of someone who intends to pick it up within seconds. He had not heard her approach, the wind direction and the ambient sound rising from the valley had worked in her favor for the past 6 minutes. She settled behind the tree line and placed the M2010 on the bipod. She brought the optic up. She put the crosshair on him. At 212 meters, this was not a long-range problem. At this distance, the ballistics were simple, the hold was minimal, the calculation was brief. At 212 meters, a 220 grain Winchester Magnum round would do what physics required it to do without any technical difficulty. She put the crosshair on center mass. She held it there. She thought about the range card she had prepared 2 days ago. She thought about the briefing room and the 22 pairs of eyes and the pen moving on a form while the last shot was still in the air. She thought about the chair at Station 2 with the cold coffee cup and the legal pad full of calculations that no one had looked at while 394 people walked into a valley she had already mapped. She moved the crosshair. She put it on the radio unit clipped to the left shoulder strap of cords. Chest rig, a standard military communications set, approximately the dimensions of a large book. The antenna extended 4 inches above the housing. She read the angle. She read the wind. She held 2 inches right of the antenna base. She fired. The round struck the radio housing at 212 meters, and the Unit fragmented in a single sharp event. The antenna was gone. Cord came off. The berm by reflex, rolling left, and he was on his knee with the rifle up. In under 2 seconds, which was a very fast response for a man who had just been shot at without warning. But he was not wounded, he was searching. She had already moved 8 meters to her right, below the berm line. She waited. He was systematic. He scanned the tree line in sections north to south with the patience of someone who had done this kind of searching many times before. He would not find her current position because she had displaced laterally. Behind a piece of ground cover he had not accounted for, she watched him work. He completed the scan. He went still. He looked at what remained of the radio unit in his hand. He set it down. He looked at the tree line again, and this time the quality of his looking was different, not searching, knowing. He said, "I hear you." She said nothing. He said, "You had the shot." She said nothing. He stood slowly. He did not raise the rifle. He stood with his hands visible, with the deliberate posture of a man making a specific statement about his intentions. He looked at the section of tree line where he had calculated she was most likely to be. He was looking 9 meters to her left. She let him look. Then she stood. He found her with his eyes in less than 2 seconds. There was no visible surprise in him. There was the stillness of someone who has trained extensively for the moment when the unexpected becomes the actual, and who has reached the place in that training where stillness is not the suppression of response, but the fullness of it. 200 meters of ridgeline between them, the valley below quieter now than it had been all morning. He said 2 words. Fort Moore. She said 2 words. Fort Moore. That was all. The words were not an exchange of sentiment. They were an identification of a specific piece of ground where the reason for everything that had happened that day had its beginning. 2 people who had been on the same firing line and had made different choices about what they saw. He had seen a problem and had chosen to resolve it in a particular way. She had seen the same problem and had chosen to document it and pursue it through every available channel until it resolved itself correctly. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he bent and placed his rifle against the earthen berm, barrel toward the ground. He stepped back from it. He turned toward the eastern slope. He walked away. Not the walk of someone who has surrendered, the walk of someone who has assessed the operational situation, found the numbers no longer workable, and is implementing the contingency plan prepared in advance. He moved downslope with efficiency and purpose, and the tree line accepted him, and he was gone. She watched the place where the trees had taken him. She did not raise the M2010. She had 1 round remaining. She had chosen not to use it on Lyle Cord, and the choice did not require explanation because it had not been made in confusion. She had come to this ridge to protect 394 people. She had done that with 5 rounds out of 6 fired. What Cord was owed was not a debt she needed to collect personally. The quick reaction force was on approach now. The federal agent who had been building the legal case for 18 months was coming through the gate. The recording that Oakes had been quietly assembling for 4 months existed. Cord could run. He could not run far enough. The punishment that fit a man who had spent his career deciding what other people deserved was not around at 200 meters. It was to watch everything he had constructed collapse in sequence, and then to live inside that collapse for a very long time. She had chosen to leave him with that. She turned south. She moved along the northern crest at the pace she could sustain for the distance ahead. The hands were still bleeding. The right hand had stopped trembling. She did not note precisely when the trembling had resolved because, by the time she noticed, it was gone. She had already been working without it for several minutes, which was the correct kind of not noticing. She had been moving south for 6 minutes when she looked toward the base. From her position on the northern crest, she had a sight line to the western perimeter of Fort Caswell that she had not had at any earlier point in the morning. The angle was oblique, and the distance was long, but the M2010 optic was built for exactly this kind of observation. She stopped. She went prone. She brought the scope up and read the gate area. There was a vehicle at the exterior checkpoint. A dark SUV stopped at the guard post in the way. A vehicle stops when the person inside is explaining to the guard personnel who they are and what their authority is. The morning light made the driver difficult to see clearly, but the federal vehicle plates were legible at this range to a person with her optic. Irene Best. She held the image and ran the logic. Cord had spoken Bast's name on the open frequency, not as an abstraction but as a specific tactical reference. He had known she was coming. He had known the approximate timing, which meant the operation on this ridge had been designed with two concurrent objectives: eliminate the sniper who could expose the falsified qualification records, and prevent the federal investigator who had been closing on those same records from accessing the base at the moment of maximum vulnerability. If there was a contingency for Bast, it was active right now, at the gate, not on the ridge. The pickup truck moved. It came from the interior of the base, from the lot adjacent to the motor pool. And it was moving faster than vehicles moved on that road under normal operating conditions. It was heading toward the interior checkpoint that connected the main installation to the exterior guard post where Bast's vehicle was waiting. She read the trajectory. She read the speed. She understood. 1 round, 1 chance, 1,150 meters. She had made longer shots that morning under worse conditions. She had made them with less clarity about what needed to happen on the other end. This one was geometrically cleaner than the secondary cast shot. The truck was moving in a straight line at a speed she could calculate. The front left tire was the correct target. A strike there would pull the vehicle hard to the driver's side and stop it before the checkpoint. She confirmed her data. Wind from the northwest at this distance, pushing the round to the right. She held left to compensate. The drop at 1,150 meters was significant, and she had been calculating drop corrections all morning. Her notebook was in her jacket. She did not need it. 28 seconds. She fired. The unsuppressed report went out across the ridgeline and traveled the full distance to the gate, and at 1,150 meters the front left tire of the truck ceased to function, and the truck pulled hard into the concrete median of the checkpoint approach lane and stopped with its front quarter against the barrier. Bast's SUV did not move. Gate personnel were out of the guardhouse and moving toward the stopped vehicle. Within 30 seconds, the driver pushed the door open before they reached Him and stepped out with both hands raised and visible. He was wearing civilian clothes over army-issue trousers and boots, the half-concealed uniform of a person who had planned to pass for a civilian until the moment. He did not need to. He said nothing when the gate personnel reached him. He did not have an explanation that was going to be useful. The investigators would find one for him before the day was over. Selden placed the M2010 in the grass in front of her. She did not throw it. She set it down with the same deliberate care she had used all morning when setting things down, because the habits of precision do not take breaks and do not make exceptions. She looked at the sky. She said. She had been moving for 3 hours and 51 minutes. She had fired 6 rounds. Every round had done exactly what she had calculated. She had not hurried. She had not improvised in the ways that fear improvises. She had done the mathematics available to her on each problem as it arrived, and she had trusted the mathematics, and the mathematics it held. She sat on the ridgeline in the morning air and breathed and let her right hand finish whatever it needed to finish. The backup radio produced a faint carrier signal at the edge of her hearing. She picked it up. The voice was not Oak's. It was someone she did not recognize, which told her something useful about what had changed in the Tactical Operations Center in the past 40 minutes. The transmission was not a request, it was a report. Read in the flat voice of someone reading numbers that matter. 388. A pause. 391. Another pause. 394. Silence for a moment after the last number. Then the same voice, the same flat. Register all personnel accounted for. 0 casualties. She looked at the field notebook lying beside the M2010 in the grass. The last notation she had made in it, 3 weeks before anyone had finalized. A training route read, probable killbox valley floor. She had been correct for 6 weeks. She had been correct when she raised her hand in a briefing room and had her own sealed medical record read aloud as evidence of her unreliability. She had been correct when she walked out of that room with her range card in her notebook and said nothing else, because nothing else was available to her in that room at that moment. She had always been correct. She had simply been operating in a system where being correct was treated as a symptom rather than a qualification, and so she had found a way to be both correct and effective simultaneously, which was a harder problem than either one alone and required more than technical skill. It required documentation. It required patience. It required the willingness to prepare for outcomes that no one around you believed were possible. She stood, she picked up the rifle, she walked back toward the base. She learned what had happened in the Tactical Operations Center in pieces, over the following hours, from sources that assembled the account gradually and from different angles. The account, when complete, was this. When Command Sergeant Major Gerald Oakes stepped through the door of Colonel Dunmore's office and pulled it closed behind him, he placed on the desk recording device no larger than a folded piece of paper, the kind available at any office supply store for less than $50. He had been carrying a version of this device in a pocket of his uniform at specific intervals. Over the previous 4 months, the device contained 18 recordings. 4 of them were conversations between Dunmore and Cord, conducted in person or by secure line in settings where Oakes had been present in an official staff capacity or had been able to position himself in proximity without arousing attention. The recordings covered the routing decisions for training exercises, the handling of formal personnel complaints, the processing of medical record, access requests, and the management of a specific sniper qualification. Evaluation outcome that had taken place 2 years earlier, the final recording, had been made 3 days prior. It contained, in Dunmore's own voice and chords, a reference to what was expected to occur in Ridgeline Valley the following morning. Dunmore had looked at the device on his desk. Oakes had said, "For months, everything." Dunmore had not reached for a phone. He had not opened a drawer. He had looked at the device, and then he had looked at Oakes, and then he had sat down in his chair, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has spent a long time managing outcomes and has finally encountered one he cannot manage. He said nothing. The aide in the outer office had been listening. He had been listening to conversations in this building for 7 months and writing what he heard in a handwriting so compact and precise that it required good light to read clearly. He had been waiting for the correct moment to give what he had written to someone with the authority to receive it. When federal investigators arrived at Fort Caswell that afternoon, he met them in the parking area. He did not wait to be found. He did not wait to be asked. He handed them the notebook and stepped back and let them read. S.A. Irene Bast received both the recordings and the aide's documentation within 40 minutes of clearing the gate. She sat in a conference room in the base legal office with both documents and read them with the systematic attention of someone who had been constructing a case for 18 months and had just received the final load-bearing element that made the structure complete. She set the documents down. She asked one question. She asked who the shooter had been on the western ridgeline. The legal officer told her. Bast looked at the table for a long moment. Then she asked to see the shooter's field notebook. The debrief that afternoon had 3 Army Inspector General investigators, 2 FBI agents, and a Judge Advocate General legal officer seated around a conference table. Selden sat at one end with her hands visible, the left one bandaged. She said very little because very little was required of her. The documents in front of the investigators provided the architecture of the case. But one document anchored everything. It was a series of photographs taken with a personal smartphone uploaded to an encrypted partition on a personal drive and backed up to an off-site server. The photographs showed every page of a green field notebook, including a terrain assessment of Ridgeline Valley and a notation at the bottom of that assessment in compact, precise handwriting. The timestamp on the upload was 3:04. The training exercise route had been finalized and approved by Colonel Brett Dunmore at 3:57. She had identified the valley as a probable killbox in writing 3 weeks before the route placing soldiers in that killbox was approved. She had then photographed that identification and created a time-stamped record of it 53 minutes before the approval signature made the document official. One of the investigators, a full colonel with the specific manner of a man who had spent a career examining what institutional failure looks like at its worst, studied the photographs for a long time. He set them down. He looked at Selden. He said, "You took these before the briefing." She said, "I take everything before the briefing." He wrote something in his own notebook. He did not ask her anything else. That afternoon, and she did not volunteer anything else, because she had learned a long time ago that the time to speak was when speaking changed something, and the documents had already said everything that needed changing. The tarmac behind the flight line at Fort Caswell was wide enough to hold a full battalion in formation, and at 17:30 that evening it did. 394 soldiers had been in the valley that morning. 394 stood in formation now. The ranks were straight, and the spacing was correct, and the light was coming across the installation from the west in the long flat way of late autumn afternoon, and the air had cooled enough that the breath of the formation rose as a faint collective mist. Above the front rank, Selden stood at the edge of the tarmac with her left arm in a field dressing, and the empty M2010 slung across her back, and the field notebook in her jacket pocket. She had come because Oakes had asked her to come, and because she had not yet found a reason to be anywhere else, and because she understood without being told that certain moments require witnesses. The battalion commander walked to the center of the formation and stopped. He did not say her name. He said Phantom Zero. The formation came to attention. Not the attention of people performing a required gesture, the attention of people who had spent the better part of a day doing the most frightening thing they had ever been asked to do and had come back from it, and who understood, now that they were standing on solid ground in the fading afternoon light, something they had not understood that morning about what the difference was between coming back and not coming back. She walked the front rank from left to right at the pace appropriate to the moment, and she looked at the faces as she passed them, the vehicle commanders, the radio operators, the medics who had treated their own people under fire, in a valley with no cover and no exit, and a QRF that had been 19 minutes further away than it should have been, the platoon leaders who had kept their formations together when the first instinct of every formation under that kind of fire is to come apart, the infantry who had held the covered position at the valley midpoint for 40 minutes on faith that something was working in their favor even though they could not see what it was. She passed them all. She reached the second rank. There was a young soldier near the middle of it. He was standing at attention, with the specific quality of a person who has made a decision about where his eyes will be and is holding to that decision with the full commitment available. To him, she had heard his voice in a corridor 2 days ago. She had been walking away from a briefing room with her range card and her notebook, and a voice behind her had said 2 words that were designed to make her feel the weight of what the system had decided about her value. She had not turned around then. She looked at his face now as she passed, and he kept his eyes forward and level, and she continued walking. She walked the length of the second rank and turned. She stood at the edge of the tarmac the formation held. The battalion commander gave the order, and 394 voices responded at once, and the sound of it went out across the tarmac and over the flight line and into the autumn air above Fort Caswell, and Selden stood at the edge of it with her bandaged hand at her side and her notebook in her pocket and her rifle on her back, and she did not move until the formation had been dismissed and the sound had finished traveling to wherever sounds go when the moment that made them is over. Oakes found her at the motor pool. The motor pool was quiet at this hour. The vehicles that had returned from the valley were staged in their assigned positions, and the few mechanics still on duty were working on the one that had taken the most structural damage, doing the work of returning things to a functional state through the application of correct procedure in the correct sequence. It was the kind of work Selden understood. She had the M2010 field stripped on the hood of a Humvee. She was cleaning the barrel with the same systematic attention she had brought to every problem. That day, starting at the chamber end and working toward the muzzle and checking her work before moving to the next component, the barrel first, then the bolt assembly, then the trigger group, each component cleaned and inspected and set aside in order until the whole was understood to be ready for whatever came next. She had not yet thought specifically about what came next because she was still cleaning this. Oak stood beside her. He looked at the components on the hood. He looked at her hands, the bandaged left and the rock-cut right. He did not comment on either. He reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket. He placed an envelope on the hood beside the cleaned bolt assembly. The envelope was not sealed. It was folded once across the middle and had no markings on the outside, except a header in the upper left corner that she recognized as a legal office designation. She had seen that designation on enough documents in the past 14 months to know the office that used it and the general category of communication that office produced. She set down the cleaning cloth. She picked up the envelope. She unfolded the paper inside. She read it. She stood with it for a moment. It was not the moment of someone who has received confirmation of what they expected. It was the moment of someone who had spent 14 months making a certain kind of peace with what she had been told she was allowed to want, and who had now received something that required her to unmake that peace and consider a different set of possibilities, something she had decided she did not want, because deciding not to want it had been the only available way to keep moving forward. Something that, now that it was in her hands, felt less like a door closing and more like a door she had not known was there. She folded the paper. She put it back in the envelope. She placed the envelope in the breast pocket of her jacket against the notebook. Oak said, "You going to tell me what it says?" She picked up the cleaning cloth. She said no. She resumed cleaning. The motor pool lights came on against the early dark. The mechanics across the lot continued their work, somewhere in the legal building on the other side of the base. The process that had begun that afternoon continued its own patient work, document by document, statement by statement, the way that accountability moves when it finally begins to move, not quickly, but without the ability to be stopped. Lyle Cord was in a vehicle somewhere on the roads north of Fort Caswell, moving away from the thing he had built and watching it collapse in the rearview mirror. The roads ahead of him were the roads that federal warrants close, and the warrants had been drafted before the afternoon was over. He could run the math on that himself. Brett Dunmore was in a conference room with his lawyer and 2 investigators, and a recording device he had never seen before that he now understood had been in the same rooms he had been in for 4 months. Gerald Oakes was standing in a motor pool at the edge of the dark, watching a soldier clean a rifle one component at a time. Selden finished the trigger group. She began reassembly in reverse order, each part finding the place it had been designed for, the whole becoming functional. Again, through the accumulated correctness of each individual step. She did not look at the envelope in her pocket. She did not need to. She already knew what she was going to do.